He just wanted a place to sleep, but 3 Apache widows wanted more. Dust rose in small clouds with every step, and the traveler's boots, worn and cracked from months of walking, kicked up more than his share. He had been on the road for days, maybe weeks. He had long lost count, and each town he passed seemed busier, noisier, and less welcoming than the last. People in the towns had been polite enough, but he had always felt like a stranger, like someone who did not belong. Now his body ached, his stomach grumbled, and all he wanted was a safe place to rest, even if only for one night. He had heard whispers from travelers he met along the way about a small village, tucked away in a valley that most people overlooked. They said it was quiet, isolated, and the villagers were cautious but fair. That sounded perfect to him. He was not looking for friends, not looking for work, and certainly not looking for trouble. He only wanted a place to lay down his head, to breathe without fear, and maybe eat a warm meal. That seemed like too much to ask in a world that had grown loud and impatient. The path to the village wound along a narrow trail between low hills, and the traveler had to pause several times to catch his breath. His clothes were dusty, his hair tangled, and his face carried the weariness of someone who had walked more than his body should have allowed. But as he crested the final hill, the valley opened up before him. The small village lay nestled in the greenery, simple houses made of wood and earth blending naturally into the landscape. Smoke rose from chimneys, curling lazily into the sky, carrying the faint scent of cooking fires and fresh bread. For the first time in weeks, the traveler felt a flicker of hope. He approached cautiously, keeping to the edges of the path, careful not to startle anyone. From a distance, he could see figures moving about, a child chasing a chicken, a man carrying a bundle of firewood, a woman hanging freshly washed clothes to dry. He hesitated, unsure if he should call out or just walk through and hope for the best. The village was quiet enough that he could hear the faint chatter of voices and the occasional laugh of a child. It reminded him of a life he had left behind, a life where people lived simply, and moments like these mattered more than wealth or ambition. It was then that he noticed the house at the edge of the village, slightly apart from the others. Smoke rose steadily from its chimney, and the garden in front was carefully tended, with herbs, flowers, and vegetables growing in neat rows. Something about it felt welcoming, not in the sense of strangers opening their doors to anyone, but in the sense that someone cared here. The traveler decided it was worth trying. He approached slowly, his hands visible, so no one would think he intended harm. At first, there was no response when he knocked on the wooden door. Then, from inside, came the sound of movement, followed by the door opening just a crack. 3 women appeared, standing side by side, their expressions cautious but not hostile. They were clearly older, though their faces were lined in different ways. One with deep creases that suggested years of hard work, another with gentler lines that spoke of quiet endurance, and the last with a sharpness in her eyes that seemed to miss nothing. The traveler bowed slightly, a gesture of respect. "Excuse me," he said, his voice hoarse from the road. "I'm looking for a place to stay, just for one night." The women studied him in silence for a moment. They had lived in this village for years, and strangers rarely came by. Most travelers passed them by, afraid of the isolation or believing the village too small to offer anything of value. But there was something in this man's eyes, tired, yes, but honest. He did not carry weapons, he did not demand, and he did not look like someone who sought to take advantage. Slowly, the woman in the middle nodded. "You may stay," she said, her voice calm but firm. "We have a place for you." Gratitude washed over the traveler. He had expected to be turned away, to wander another night with nowhere to rest. Instead, here was a small haven, offered without conditions, and he could not help but feel a sense of relief he had not felt in weeks. The women stepped aside, allowing him to enter. The house was modest but clean, with wooden floors that creaked softly under his weight, and a fire already burning in the hearth. The warmth was immediate and comforting, chasing away some of the chill that had settled in his bones. One of the women handed him a bowl of stew. It was simple meat, vegetables, and herbs, but it was hot, nourishing, and made with care. The traveler ate slowly, savoring each bite, feeling more human with every mouthful. As he ate, he noticed the quiet efficiency of the house. The women moved about without speaking much, tending to their chores and occasionally glancing at him. There was no overt friendliness, no attempt to pry into his life, only a steady presence that felt safer than any walls or locks could provide. After he finished, one of the widows led him to a small room at the back of the house. It had a single bed, clean blankets, and a small window that looked out over the fields beyond. The traveler sank onto the bed, exhaustion pulling at him like a heavy weight. For the first time in a long while, he felt he could breathe freely. He listened to the faint sounds of the village outside, the soft steps of the women moving about, and the crackle of the fire in the hearth. He realized that this place, these people, had given him more than just shelter. They had given him a moment of peace, a chance to feel human again. As he drifted toward sleep, his mind wandered briefly to the women themselves. He noticed the small details, the way they worked together silently, the unspoken communication between them, the quiet strength they carried from years of loss. He did not know their stories, and they did not volunteer them. But there was a sense of history in the house, of lives lived fully and fully felt, and he sensed that meeting them was no accident. Perhaps life had led him here not just for rest, but to witness something he could not have imagined. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying the scent of earth and growing things. The village settled into evening, lights flickering in the small houses, children calling to each other in fading laughter. Inside, the traveler closed his eyes, his body finally surrendering to sleep, but his mind quietly alert to the quiet energy of the household. The three widows had offered him a place to sleep, yes, but even as he lay there, he could not shake the feeling that this simple act of kindness might carry consequences he did not yet understand. Night deepened, and the traveler dreamed lightly of roads traveled and roads yet to come. He dreamed of safety and rest, of warmth and food, and of quiet faces that held more than met the eye. When he awoke the next morning, he would find that life in this small village, with these three women, would be far more complex than a simple place to sleep. But for now, the simple comfort of warmth and human care was enough. He had entered seeking nothing but shelter, but even in those first hours, it became clear that the quiet generosity of the widows carried a depth he could neither ignore nor fully understand. He was a stranger in their midst, yet already he felt part of something unfamiliar, something alive and unspoken that would challenge him in ways he had not yet imagined. And though he did not know it yet, this night would be the beginning of a story far more intricate than he had ever expected, one that would test his patience, his heart, and the very way he understood kindness and connection. The morning light spilled gently through the small window, brushing the traveler's face with warmth. He awoke to the quiet sounds of the house, soft footsteps on the wooden floor, the faint clatter of dishes being arranged, and the distant hum of voices from the village beyond. For a moment, he lay still, taking in the calm and comfort of this place. The previous night had been the first night of real rest he had enjoyed in weeks. The ache in his muscles had lessened, and his mind felt lighter if only slightly. When he finally rose, he found the three widows already busy with the day's chores. One was sweeping the floor with practiced movements, the other tended to the small garden outside, checking the plants carefully, while the third was preparing breakfast. The traveler watched quietly, unsure of how to step into this world without disturbing it. Though the widows had welcomed him, he realized that he was still very much an outsider. Yet, there was no sense of hostility, only a quiet rhythm of life that seemed to welcome him in its own way. He moved to help, carrying water from the well and chopping wood for the fire. The widows accepted his assistance with small nods, their eyes observing him with interest but not pressing for conversation. It was clear that they valued action over words. Through this simple cooperation, the traveler began to feel a sense of belonging, even though he had arrived only hours earlier. There was a silent agreement between them, a shared understanding that work and care could communicate more than words ever could. Breakfast was a modest affair, with fresh bread, eggs, and the stew left over from the night before. As they ate, the traveler noticed the quiet communication among the women. They spoke little to him directly, yet through gestures and glances, he sensed a strong bond of trust and respect. Each had her own story etched into her face, her movements, and her eyes. One looked at him with a mix of curiosity and caution, another with quiet amusement, and the third with a sharp attentiveness, as though measuring him silently. Though they did not reveal their histories outright, he felt that their lives had been shaped by loss and resilience. The traveler tried to engage them in conversation, asking about the village, the land, and their daily routines. The women answered politely but sparingly. They did not pry into his life, and he did not offer much beyond what was necessary. Yet in those small exchanges, he felt a subtle connection growing. There was a rhythm to the household that was calming, a sense of shared purpose and care that was unlike anything he had experienced in towns or on the road. As the day progressed, he accompanied one of the widows to the nearby river to fetch water. The path was narrow and winding, flanked by wildflowers and tall grass. Birds sang in the trees, and the sound of the flowing river grew louder with each step. During the walk, they spoke quietly about the land, its seasons, its challenges, and the quiet beauty that often went unnoticed by outsiders. The traveler listened more than he spoke, absorbing the details, the care, and the reverence they held for the world around them. He began to understand that life here was slower, more deliberate, and that each small action carried meaning. Back at the house, he spent the afternoon helping with chores, repairing a section of the roof and tending to the garden. The women watched him, sometimes offering guidance, sometimes simply observing. He noticed how their eyes lingered on him, not in judgment but in careful consideration. They were testing him, perhaps, or simply learning whether he was trustworthy, capable, and sincere. He did not mind the scrutiny. In fact, it made him reflect on his own life, his own intentions, and the choices that had brought him here. Over time, small moments of warmth began to emerge. One widow, noticing that his hands were raw from the wood chopping, quietly rubbed balm into his palms while he was distracted. Another offered him a fresh towel with a gentle smile. The third brought him a cup of herbal tea, carefully brewed to soothe his tired stomach. These gestures were simple, yet they carried a weight far greater than any words could express. They spoke of care, attention, and perhaps even an unspoken desire to connect with someone outside their world. Despite these gestures, the traveler remained cautious. He appreciated their kindness, yet he sensed that there was more behind their actions. He wondered about the boundaries of their generosity, about the expectations that might accompany such warmth. He did not want to offend, nor did he wish to overstep. Yet he could not ignore the subtle tension that seemed to hover in the air, a mixture of curiosity, desire, and human connection that was difficult to define. As evening approached, the traveler sat by the fire, reflecting on the day. The widows had continued their routines, preparing dinner, mending clothes, and tending to the household with quiet efficiency. He had learned small details about each of them. The widow with the soft eyes had a gentle way of speaking to animals. The one with the sharp gaze could remember every small thing that happened in the village, and the one with the quiet laugh had a sense of humor that could appear in the simplest of moments. Each of them carried their pasts with grace, yet there was also an unmistakable air of longing, as if life had not entirely fulfilled them. He realized that while he had come seeking nothing more than rest, the women were offering more than shelter. They were offering connection. They were inviting him, in subtle ways, into a part of their lives that had been shaped by loss, resilience, and strength. The traveler understood that accepting this invitation meant more than simply staying in their house. It meant engaging with emotions he had long avoided, navigating boundaries he had never considered, and confronting the complexity of human relationships in ways he had never anticipated. Night fell again, and the traveler found himself lying in bed, listening to the quiet murmurs of the house. He could hear the women moving about, the soft rustle of fabric, the quiet hum of voices speaking to one another in tones he could not fully understand. There was a rhythm to their lives, a pattern of care and attention that made him feel included, even as a stranger. Sleep came slowly that night, not from discomfort, but from the quiet storm of thoughts and feelings that the day had stirred within him. In the dark, he thought about the paths that had led him here, the roads traveled, the towns passed, the faces seen and forgotten. He realized that this village and these women were unlike anything he had encountered. They were cautious, yet open, strong, yet vulnerable, reserved, yet capable of deep care. He felt a mixture of gratitude, curiosity, and unease. He did not know what tomorrow would bring, but he sensed that his stay here was only the beginning of something far more significant than a simple rest. As the wind whispered outside the window and the fire crackled faintly, the traveler understood that this day had changed him in subtle ways. He had come seeking shelter, and he had found more, insights into human nature, glimpses of resilience, and the quiet power of compassion. The widows had given him a place to sleep, yes, but they had also offered him a window into a life shaped by care, struggle, and quiet connection. And as he drifted into a deep, dreamless sleep, he felt the faint pull of anticipation, a sense that the days ahead would demand more of him than he had ever expected, not just in action, but in heart. He had entered this small, isolated village as a stranger, seeking only rest, yet he had become part of a subtle and intricate web of lives, emotions, and unspoken bonds. He did not yet understand the full depth of what lay ahead, but even in that quiet night, he felt the stirring of a story that would change him, and those around him forever. The next morning, the traveler woke to a soft light spilling into his room, the quiet of the house, already alive with movement. The three widows were up early, as usual, tending to chores, preparing meals, and organizing the small household with a rhythm he was slowly beginning to understand. He moved quietly, mindful not to disturb the delicate balance of their space. Though he had begun to feel a sense of comfort and belonging, he also knew he remained a guest in their lives, an outsider who had stumbled into a world that functioned on unspoken rules and careful attention to one another. Breakfast was once again a simple affair, yet it carried the warmth of home in every bite. Fresh bread, soft-cooked eggs, and sweetened herbal tea filled the table. The traveler noticed small details he had not before: the careful way one widow placed utensils for each person, the other's attention to the fire so that the meal remained warm, and the quiet smile of the third as she watched him eat. It was not merely hospitality. It was a form of communication, a way of expressing care without words. Each gesture carried meaning, and he could sense the subtle undercurrents in the way they interacted with him. After breakfast, the widows suggested he help with a project they had been working on, a small shed at the back of the house that needed repairs. It was an unusual task for a visitor, yet he did not hesitate. He fetched tools, held wooden planks, and worked alongside them under the morning sun. The labor was not heavy, but it required attention and cooperation. As they worked, the widows began to speak more freely, sharing fragments of their lives. One spoke of her late husband, a man who had loved the land and the animals with a quiet passion. Another mentioned her children, long grown and far away, whom she missed dearly. The third spoke of the hardships she had endured and the strength she had found in living alone. The traveler listened carefully, offering small words of encouragement but never prying. He realized that their stories were not just recollections, they were lessons, fragments of wisdom wrapped in experience. He began to feel the weight of their trust, even though it was offered in small doses. The widows had allowed him into their home, and now they were letting him into their world, sharing memories and feelings that few outsiders had ever witnessed. He felt honored, yet uneasy, knowing that with this trust came responsibility. As the day progressed, a subtle tension began to grow. The widows' attentions were no longer only practical, there was an emotional weight to their actions. Small gestures, a hand brushing against his sleeve while handing him a tool, a quiet glance that lingered longer than necessary, a soft laugh directed at him, began to stir feelings he had long suppressed. He recognized that he was not merely a guest anymore. He was becoming part of their emotional landscape. It was a strange sensation, one that both intrigued and unsettled him. One afternoon, a sudden rainstorm swept over the village. The sky darkened quickly, and the wind carried the scent of wet earth and grass. The traveler and the widows found themselves trapped inside the small house, the shed still unfinished and exposed to the weather. Lightning flashed, illuminating the room in brief, bright bursts, and thunder rumbled in the distance. They gathered around the fire, which the women tended carefully to keep the room warm. The traveler watched as each widow moved with practiced efficiency, their coordination almost seamless. He was struck by their resilience and their ability to maintain calm even as the storm raged outside. The storm created an atmosphere of intimacy. The sounds of rain pounding against the roof, the flickering firelight, and the closeness of the space made their interactions more intense. Conversations became quieter, more personal. The widows asked about his life, his travels, and the people he had met. He answered cautiously, revealing enough to be honest but not so much as to feel vulnerable. He began to sense that the widows were not merely curious. They were assessing his character, his integrity, and the depth of his heart. It was a test, subtle and unspoken, and he realized that his responses would shape the way their relationships unfolded. As the evening stretched on, the emotional undertones grew stronger. The traveler noticed the way the widow's eyes followed him, the way their hands lingered briefly in the presence of his, and the softness in their voices that was reserved only for him. He felt a mix of admiration, respect, and confusion. He did not want to overstep boundaries, yet he could not ignore the quiet pull of connection. He realized that their intentions were layered. Beneath the hospitality and kindness lay desires, expectations, and emotions that were not easily articulated. At one point, one widow placed her hand gently on his shoulder while passing him a cup of tea. The contact was brief, yet it sent a ripple through him that he could not easily dismiss. He glanced at her, meeting her eyes for the first time in a way that felt more intimate than polite. There was no malice, no manipulation, only a quiet longing, tempered by years of life's hardships. He quickly averted his gaze, unsure how to respond. The moment passed, but the memory lingered, leaving him both curious and cautious. Throughout the evening, he reflected on his feelings and the complexity of the situation. He had come seeking rest, and instead found himself navigating a delicate web of emotions. He realized that the widow's intentions were not simple. They were layered with care, loneliness, and perhaps even hope. It was a test of his own judgment, his ability to understand human nuance, and his willingness to engage with people in a sincere and respectful way. He began to understand that this stay was not just about shelter. It was a lesson in empathy, patience, and the subtle dynamics of relationships. As the storm subsided and the night deepened, the traveler found a quiet moment to sit alone by the fire. He watched the flickering flames, thinking about the women and the path that had led him here. He realized that their lives were rich with experience and emotion, and that they had chosen to share a part of that with him. He felt a deep respect for their strength, a fascination with their complexity, and a cautious awareness of the responsibility that came with their trust. Before going to bed, he paused to observe the widows one last time. They moved about the house with quiet efficiency, preparing for the night, their movements synchronized yet independent. He noticed the subtle expressions on their faces, the softness, the vigilance, the occasional spark of curiosity or amusement. He realized that they were testing him, not in a confrontational way, but to see if he could navigate the delicate balance of human connection with honesty and care. It was a challenge he was beginning to understand, though not yet fully equipped to meet. That night, as he lay in bed listening to the soft creaks of the house and the distant whispers of the village, the traveler felt a growing awareness of the emotional landscape he had entered. The widows had welcomed him with shelter, guided him with care, and now invited him subtly into a deeper connection. He did not know what tomorrow would bring, but he understood that the relationships forming here would demand more than gratitude. They would require sincerity, attentiveness, and an openness to emotions he had long avoided. He drifted into sleep with these thoughts, aware that his journey was no longer just a physical one. He had come seeking rest, and now he was embarking on a journey of understanding, of human connection, trust, and the quiet power of shared vulnerability. The storm outside had passed, but the storm of emotions within the house was only beginning to stir. And though he did not yet know the outcome, he sensed that this stay, brief as it had seemed at first, would leave an indelible mark on him and on the lives of the three widows who had opened their home to a stranger. The next morning promised new challenges, small tests of trust, and moments that would reveal the true depth of their intentions. But for now, the traveler lay quietly, feeling the weight and warmth of the unspoken bonds forming around him. He had entered this house seeking only shelter, and yet he had become part of something far more intricate, far more human, and far more compelling than he could have imagined. The morning sun crept slowly over the horizon, casting golden light across the small village and warming the modest house where the traveler had stayed for several days. The air was fresh, carrying the scent of damp earth, blooming flowers, and the faint smoke of cooking fires. The traveler awoke feeling more rested than he had in weeks, yet a tension lingered in his chest, a quiet awareness that the dynamics in the house were shifting. The three widows, whose kindness had initially been so simple and comforting, were now revealing subtle complexities in their behavior that he could not ignore. As he dressed and prepared for the day, he noticed the way the widows watched him with careful attention. Their eyes were no longer merely observing his actions. They seemed to be studying his character, reading the expressions on his face and gauging his reactions. It was a mixture of curiosity and something deeper, a silent questioning of who he was, what he wanted, and whether he could be trusted. He understood that their hospitality came with unspoken expectations, and he felt both intrigued and cautious. Breakfast was quiet, more reflective than usual. The widows moved about the table with deliberate grace, serving food and exchanging glances that he sensed held more meaning than the words themselves. He realized that they were testing him, not in a harsh or confrontational way, but in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. Each gesture, each glance, each smile carried a question, and he found himself navigating a delicate balance between appreciation, respect, and self-awareness. Later in the morning, one widow invited him to help repair a section of the fence surrounding their garden. The work was simple but required cooperation, patience, and attention to detail. As they worked side by side, he noticed small signs of emotional connection. The brief touch of a hand as they passed tools, a lingering glance when he looked away too quickly, a quiet laugh shared over a small mistake. These moments were innocent enough on the surface, yet they carried a weight that he could not dismiss. He realized that the widows were expressing more than gratitude. They were offering pieces of themselves, testing his sensitivity and understanding. By midday, the traveler began to feel a sense of unease. He cared for the widows and appreciated their kindness, yet he could sense the depth of their expectations. They wanted more than his presence. They wanted engagement, attention, and perhaps even emotional intimacy. He wrestled with conflicting feelings: loyalty and gratitude toward their generosity, curiosity about the connections forming, and a strong desire to maintain his independence. He understood that he could not avoid these emotions forever. Eventually, choices would have to be made. During lunch, one of the widows spoke more openly than before. She shared memories of her late husband, the hardships she had endured alone, and her quiet hopes for the future. Her voice carried a subtle longing, and her eyes lingered on the traveler in a way that was both tender and searching. Another widow watched the exchange with a soft, almost imperceptible smile, while the third seemed to study him carefully, as though measuring his reactions and intentions. The traveler listened intently, offering small words of empathy, but he remained mindful not to overstep. He realized that the emotional stakes were rising, and that every action and word mattered. In the afternoon, a disagreement arose over a simple household task. The traveler suggested a way to repair a small section of the roof that the widows had not considered, and though his idea was practical, it was met with quiet resistance. The widows exchanged subtle glances, and he sensed a tension forming, not from anger, but from pride, history, and emotion. It was a test of patience and understanding, an unspoken challenge to see how he would navigate conflict with respect and care. He realized that this was no longer a simple stay. It was an initiation into a complex web of relationships, where trust and sensitivity were as important as any physical task. As evening approached, the tension in the house remained, mingled with moments of warmth and care. The widows continued their routines, but their gestures were now layered with emotion, small touches, lingering glances, and quiet smiles that spoke of both hope and expectation. The traveler felt the weight of these subtle communications, and he understood that he could not remain passive. His decisions, his attentiveness, and his honesty would shape the direction of these relationships, and he needed to act with care. One widow approached him quietly while the others were busy, and spoke in a soft voice about her feelings. She expressed a desire for companionship, for someone to share not just the household duties but the small joys and sorrows of life. Her words were gentle, yet carried a depth of emotion that startled him. He realized that she was inviting him into a level of intimacy he had not anticipated. At the same time, he understood that accepting this invitation would alter the dynamics of the household, affecting not only his relationship with her, but also with the other two widows. The traveler spent the rest of the evening in contemplation. He walked quietly to the edge of the garden, looking out at the fields bathed in moonlight, trying to make sense of his feelings and the situation at hand. He valued the widows' trust and care, yet he felt unprepared for the emotional complexity they were offering. He knew that he could not ignore the subtle invitations or the expectations being placed upon him, but he also knew that he could not make decisions lightly. The stakes were not merely personal. They were emotional, delicate, and intertwined with the lives of people who had already shown him great generosity. As night fell, the house became quiet, and the traveler returned to his room to rest. He lay in bed, reflecting on the choices before him. He had come seeking nothing more than a place to sleep, yet he now faced decisions that involved compassion, honesty, and emotional courage. He realized that his journey was no longer about physical survival or rest. It was about understanding human connections, navigating desires and expectations, and acting with integrity. He felt a growing sense of responsibility, not only to himself, but also to the widows who had welcomed him into their lives. Throughout the night, he replayed the day's interactions in his mind. He considered the subtle ways the widows had tested him, the emotional cues he had noticed, and the small but significant moments of connection. He understood that the bonds forming in this house were fragile, built on trust, care, and the willingness to engage honestly. He also recognized that one wrong step, one careless word, could disrupt the delicate balance. The traveler felt both the weight and the beauty of the responsibility before him. By morning, he knew he needed to act thoughtfully. He could no longer simply follow the flow of their routines. He needed to engage with intention, empathy, and honesty. He had to recognize the emotions of the widows, respect their desires, and navigate the subtle currents of connection without overstepping or causing hurt. He understood that the days ahead would demand his full attention, not just to practical tasks, but to the emotional landscape of the household. The traveler also recognized something more profound. Through this experience, he was learning about himself. He had always valued independence and simplicity, but now he saw that human connections, even when complicated, could bring meaning, growth, and unexpected joy. The widows were not merely testing him. They were offering him a chance to engage with life on a deeper level, to experience empathy, understanding, and care in ways he had never allowed himself before. By the time the sun rose high in the sky, the traveler had made a quiet decision. He would remain honest, attentive, and compassionate. He would recognize the boundaries, yet respond to the subtle invitations of connection. He would navigate the emotional currents with care, understanding that trust and intimacy were earned through patience, respect, and sincerity. In doing so, he hoped to honor not only his own journey, but also the generosity and courage of the widows who had welcomed him into their lives. The day ahead promised challenges, tests of character, moments of tension, and opportunities for growth. But it also promised connection, understanding, and the possibility of shared joy. The traveler had arrived seeking a place to sleep, and yet he had discovered a world far richer, more complex, and more human than he had ever imagined. The lessons of the household were becoming clear. Life was not only about survival, but also about the delicate and beautiful process of connecting with others, navigating expectations, and responding with integrity and care. As he prepared to face the day, the traveler felt a mixture of anticipation and resolve. He understood that the road he had taken to reach this village was only the beginning. The real journey, the journey of the heart, of understanding, and of navigating human connections, was unfolding within these walls. And though he did not yet know the outcome, he felt ready to engage, to listen, and to respond with the honesty and respect that this fragile, intricate, and deeply human situation demanded. The morning sun rose slowly over the village, casting soft light on the small house that had become both a refuge and a place of quiet tension for the traveler. The air was filled with the scent of fresh earth, the subtle aroma of herbs from the garden, and the faint smoke curling from the hearth. Today, more than ever, he felt the weight of the decisions before him. He had come seeking nothing but a place to sleep, yet over the past days, he had become deeply entangled in the lives of the three widows who had opened their home to him. Breakfast was a quiet affair, filled with unspoken understanding. The widows moved with their usual grace, but he noticed an air of expectation that had not been present in the first days of his stay. Their gestures were careful, their glances deliberate, and he realized that the moment of choice he had been sensing for days had finally arrived. Each of them had invested emotionally in his presence, subtly weaving their hopes and desires into the fabric of daily life. The traveler understood that he could no longer remain passive. He had to act with honesty, care, and thoughtfulness. After breakfast, he spent some time helping with the household chores, moving deliberately, aware of the delicate balance in the room. He noticed the quiet glances, the brief touches, and the small smiles directed at him, all of which carried meaning far beyond their simple gestures. He reflected on the days he had spent in this house, the trust they had extended to him, and the depth of connection that had quietly formed. It was clear to him that the widows sought more than his presence. They sought understanding, sincerity, and perhaps companionship in a world that had taken much from them. As the day progressed, the traveler found himself engaged in conversations that were more personal than before. One widow spoke of the dreams she had set aside after the loss of her husband, the quiet ambition she had hidden behind resilience, and the loneliness that still lingered despite her strong exterior. Another shared the joys and struggles of raising her children alone, the moments of pride that sustained her, and the quiet sorrows she had carried silently. The third spoke with honesty about her feelings of longing, her hopes for connection, and her cautious optimism that life could still offer companionship and warmth. Listening to them, the traveler felt a growing sense of responsibility. He understood that any decision he made would impact not just himself, but the emotional well-being of the women who had welcomed him. He could not ignore their desires, nor could he allow his own hesitation to cause confusion or hurt. The situation required courage, empathy, and clarity. For the first time in days, he felt the full weight of the emotional complexity that had been quietly building around him. In the afternoon, the widows asked him to sit with them in the garden. The sun warmed the earth, and the gentle breeze carried the scent of flowers and growing vegetables. It was a peaceful setting, yet the conversation that followed was laden with meaning. Each widow spoke openly about her feelings, the ways she had come to trust him, and the subtle hopes she held. Their words were tender, sincere, and measured. They were not demanding, nor were they aggressive. They were simply expressing the depth of human emotion that had quietly grown over the past days. The traveler responded with honesty, speaking of his gratitude for their kindness, his admiration for their strength, and his respect for the trust they had shown him. He explained that while he valued the bonds forming between them, he needed to navigate them with care and consideration. His words were deliberate, chosen to convey sincerity without overstepping boundaries. He wanted them to understand that his appreciation went beyond mere politeness. It was rooted in genuine respect for their lives, their experiences, and the connection they had shared. As the afternoon wore on, the tension that had lingered began to shift. The widows recognized his honesty and his careful attention to their feelings. There was a quiet acceptance in the air, a sense that boundaries had been acknowledged and that trust had been reinforced. Though their desires remained, there was also clarity, an understanding that relationships required both respect and sincerity, and that the traveler's presence was valued not just for what he could offer, but for the integrity with which he engaged. In the evening, the household settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and different. The traveler moved about with attentiveness, helping with chores, preparing meals, and offering small gestures of care. The widows, in turn, responded with warmth, appreciation, and subtle affection. It was a delicate balance, one that required awareness, patience, and empathy. The traveler felt a profound sense of connection, not only with the women, but with the life they had shared and the lessons they had imparted. He realized that the true gift of this experience was not shelter alone, but the opportunity to engage deeply with human emotions, kindness, and understanding. As night fell, the traveler found himself sitting quietly by the fire, reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. He thought of the roads he had traveled, the towns he had passed, and the moments of loneliness and struggle that had defined his life until now. And yet, he also recognized the transformation that had occurred within him over the past days. He had entered the house seeking rest, but he had found connection, insight, and a deeper appreciation for the complexities of human emotion. He realized that the widows, too, had been transformed by this encounter. The brief intrusion of a stranger had stirred feelings they had long held in silence, reminding them of the power of trust, care, and emotional openness. Their kindness had created a space where vulnerability could be shared safely, where the heart could be both tested and nurtured. The traveler felt honored to have been part of this process, and he understood that the lessons he had learned would stay with him long after he left the village. Before retiring for the night, he walked to the edge of the garden, looking out at the moonlit fields. The stars sparkled overhead, and the village lay quiet in the gentle embrace of night. He felt a profound sense of gratitude, not only for the shelter he had received, but for the human connections that had formed, the trust that had been extended, and the subtle lessons of empathy and understanding that he had gained. He understood that life's richness often came not from the grand or the dramatic, but from these quiet, meaningful encounters that tested the heart and nurtured the soul. The next morning, the traveler prepared to leave. He had made his choice, to honor the relationships he had formed by remaining honest, respectful, and grateful. He said his farewells to the widows with words that carried sincerity and warmth, expressing his deep appreciation for the trust, care, and connection they had shared. Each widow responded with quiet smiles, a touch on the shoulder, or a soft nod, acknowledging both the bond that had been formed and the independence he had chosen to maintain. As he walked away from the house, the traveler carried with him more than belongings and memories of a place to sleep. He carried lessons about human nature, the complexity of trust, and the beauty of genuine connection. He understood that kindness could be both simple and profound, that generosity often carried unspoken hopes, and that navigating relationships with honesty and care was a journey in itself. The three widows had offered him shelter, yes, but they had also offered him insight, empathy, and a reminder that the human heart is capable of remarkable resilience and depth. Days later, as he traveled down the winding road away from the village, the traveler reflected on the experience. He thought of the quiet mornings, the shared meals, the subtle gestures, and the conversations that had unfolded like a delicate dance. He realized that this encounter, brief though it had been, had altered him in ways he could not yet fully measure. It had taught him patience, awareness, and the value of emotional honesty. He felt a renewed sense of purpose and a quiet hope that the connections we form, even fleeting ones, can leave lasting impressions on the lives of others and our own. Though the village faded behind him, the memory of the three widows remained vivid. Their strength, kindness, and emotional intelligence were etched into his mind. He understood that life was made richer not by the places we visit or the possessions we acquire, but by the relationships we build and the care we extend. The simple act of sharing a home, a meal, or a conversation could ripple outward, leaving lasting marks on hearts and lives. And so, the traveler continued his journey, carrying with him the warmth, lessons, and quiet power of the experience. He had entered seeking nothing but a place to sleep, yet he had discovered a story of trust, care, and human connection that would remain with him forever. The three widows had wanted more than a guest. They had offered him the gift of understanding, empathy, and the profound realization that even in brief encounters, hearts can connect, lives can change, and kindness can create ripples that last long after the moment has passed. As he walked into the horizon, the traveler felt a sense of peace and fulfillment. He had learned that the simplest gestures, shelter, care, attention, and honesty, can carry immense meaning. The experience had taught him about the beauty of human resilience, the importance of empathy, and the quiet strength found in genuine connection. He would never forget the lessons, the moments, or the people who had shared their lives with him, and he knew that wherever he went, these memories would guide him in understanding the world and the hearts of those he met.